Many years ago now, we worked for one of the big mining companies in South Africa, as it happened. And the thing we were asked them to help them on was their safety, their operational safety in the mines, because they did not have a good safety record. And, people were dying. And, people were dying, people were getting injured. I mean, this was pretty serious stuff. And the hypothesis going in, their hypothesis, and I have to say ours, was that this is a question of policy. We needed to help them benchmark world-class safety policies and align. So we did. And what we found is their policies were already world-class. The problem wasn't the policy. The problem was the application of the policy. And it was actually the individual decisions that their kind of frontline mining employees were making to disregard, in effect, the policy. So, for example, the policy would say you shouldn't go in the mine shaft if the machine is switched on, and people would do that, and then the machine would start, and they would, something horrible would happen. So then we had to kind of work back from that and say, well, why are those people making decisions that are putting their own safety at risk, and what is it that can be done to change the environment in which they're doing that? And without getting into all the details, that proved to be a much more fertile line of inquiry. And it seems obvious with the benefit of hindsight, but it wasn't going in. So a lot of these people were illiterate. So giving them a safety manual and saying, read this wasn't going to work. This was, not long after the end of apartheid. There was still a lot of racism. Most of the frontline supervisors were white. All of the frontline workers were black. There wasn't as much concern for their welfare on the part of the frontline supervisors as there needed to be, which had a very dramatic effect on how the company then started to think about that role and who to put in that role and what kind of training to equip them with and so on. And the one that I always enjoy the most is what we also found was that the frontline employees themselves were, even when they knew the policy, were kind of disregarding it because they felt like they wanted to get more shift time. And so they would cut corners in order to maximize shift time because that would maximize their earnings and what they could send home to the family and so on. And one of the most powerful interventions that the client then made was to go to the communities where these guys came from, they were all guys, and talk to their wives and their mothers about the importance of safety. And through that, sort of put pressure, if you like, or educate them on putting their life and their safety ahead of, short-term shift considerations. And that was very effective. And in fact, the story had a very happy ending because these changes worked and the safety record improved dramatically. And what was interesting was so did productivity because they were having less, downtime. When an accident happens, obviously the whole operation has to stop while they figure out what it is that's caused it. And so, in fact, productivity improved, and these guys started earning more anyway. But again, this was an example of not a big strategic sort of bet the business decision, but something you might think mundane in some ways, which is just the everyday decisions that the mine workers were making about their own safety. But it turned out to be very fruitful to take a sort of the other end of the telescope and think about that decision and what was motivating them to think and act in the ways they were.
So your starting inquiry was, how are you making this decision, or
we have this concept, and again, I'm sorry, some of this may be a bit jargony, but we talk about decision architecture. Okay, so decision architecture it's a way of thinking about like you have a kind of skeleton of a tall building. The decision architecture is the skeleton of an organization. And in many ways, again, it's a cliche, but we would say an organization is the sum of the decisions it makes and executes. And the great thing about a decision architecture is you can sort of zoom up or zoom down, and you can think of categories of decisions, and then you can get down to an individual decision. And it's not manageable to operate at the level of, any large organization is making and executing millions of decisions every day. And you can't, design that in, but you can zoom in where you need to, and that's what happened here, right? So the broad category was operational safety, But then what we realized is out of all the possible decisions we could have looked at, it was the decision that the frontline worker was making on whether or not to comply with safety policy.